Hello, everyone.
Hello, hello.
So
Hello.
I'm on there twice because I'm doing this with two computers.
I am, oh, my video is not working yet. I am not in my normal location, and I am using an unusual microphone. Is this sounding good enough?
Yeah, it sounds good, Harvey.
Okay, great. The one built into the computer sounded terrible, so I went and scrounged something out of a box.
Yeah, no, this is good.
Good.
And I just got the word from Kathy that she's on the way home. So we'll just go ahead and Harvey, you can go ahead and do the introduction to Gary, and then Gary will introduce Louise.
Okay. And then do I have anything else? Do you want me to do any kind of a close or something? I realized I hadn't thought about that.
We're going to get Louise to do that.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I realize I'm just here because I'm here. I've actually been part of the planning, so I don't want to end up stepping on the plans.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I think we're okay.
Gary, you're going to give a shout out to Mark too, aren't you, about working with you on this?
Yeah, is Mark going to be on? Do we know?
I have not heard from him, so I'm assuming that he's not, unless we hear otherwise.
And Harvey, there's one comment I wanted to make about your introduction.
Yeah.
Here where you say with a possible extension to Spokane.
Yes.
I think I would say proposed restoration of service between Western Washington, Pasco, or Western Washington, Kittitas Valley, Yakima Valley, Tri-Cities, and
do we really want to mention that many places?
And
Okay.
Spokane.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we do, Harvey. That's how we've been saying it.
Yeah.
How do you spell Kittitas?
Kittitas.
Yeah. Western Washington via Stampede Pass, Kittitas County.
Well, we aren't taking the pass. We'd be the Stampede Pass Tunnel, right?
Yeah, it's through the tunnel. Tunnel's fine if you want to say tunnel.
Okay.
And then
Pass Tunnel, Kittitas Valley, Yakima River Valley.
just Yakima Valley is fine. No rivers needed. Yakima Valley, Tri-Cities, and Spokane.
Yeah, that's how we've been advertising it, Harvey. So I think that's
and those are
probably
the cities. Those are the areas that are specifically called out in the study.
Okay, so this isn't quite making sense yet, but I'm sure we can fix it. Right now it's saying proposed restoration of service between Western Washington and Pasco via blah, 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 and Spokane. So that doesn't work.
Yes.
But the proposal is for definitely to Spokane and definitely to Pasco and maybe to Spokane, right? That's what the legislature, the proviso was for.
There was never any maybe about Spokane.
Yeah,
Right?
it was. Yeah,
Oh,
it was.
No,
it was in the study.
Yeah, that's kind of why it's called the East-West project, because it actually did go east to west and west to east.
All right. So then I'll say this. I'll just read the whole sentence. He leads our board committee focused on supporting the efforts of the state legislature to research the proposed restoration of service between Western Washington and Spokane via the Stampede Pass Tunnel, Kittitas Valley, Yakima Valley, and Tri-Cities.
Yep, that's good. That's good. That's fine.
And then I'll leave out the part about quite appropriate, because that was that makes the sentence really go on.
That's okay. You can leave that out. I'll just tell them I live in Yakima.
Well, I was just going to say I'd put it up in there. My interviewer is Gary Wirt of Yakima.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so welcome everyone to tonight's train trek to Spokane and beyond. I'm Harvey Bowen, president of All Aboard Washington, and no, I'm not going to sing the Star Trek theme song when I'm really doing this. And I'm glad to see the online participants tonight, and also to welcome later viewers watching recordings of this event. It's my honor to introduce Gary Wirt of Yakima, Washington. Gary is okay, I've gotten too far here, so I need to say All Aboard AWA again. AWA. Gary is an AAWA board member and vice president of All Aboard Washington, who has been focusing his volunteering on our efforts to add and expand passenger rail services in Eastern Washington. He leads our board committee focused on supporting the efforts of the state legislature to research the proposed restoration of service between Western Washington and Spokane via the Stampede Pass Tunnel, Kittitas Valley, Yakima Valley, and Tri-Cities. Gary.
Yeah, that's fine.
And that's your cue.
There we go. And now I'm going to introduce Luis, but I've got to find I gotta find the comments he just sent me here, and I can print them out. Just a minute.
Yeah, I got it set up so that my pictures of everybody else are blinking in and out because that screen is not reliable as a second screen. But my picture with my screen with the script is perfectly legible all the time. It's going to be right there. And then once I've done my presentation, I will switch my camera to off as well as muting.
Yeah, that's fine.
And let me make sure that my camera off is the one I want it to be. Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, I gotta just a minute. I'll be right back. I gotta go to my printer.
And then I can switch it all over to the screen that's reliable to see the rest of the program.
I see the TVW is already, are they hooked on now? Watching?
Yes, I talked to Eva a little while ago on email. She is here. She will be watching. She says we won't hear her, but will be available.
Great. Does that mean that we're running in real time on TVW today?
I believe so, yes.
Great. That's what I thought and what I was planning to watch when I didn't think I was going to be somewhere I could join up.
Yeah, it will not be broadcast, but it will be on the stream.
Okay, great.
See here, where are we
I
now?
really don't know how many people get it on TVW on broadcast anyway. I guess you'd have to have cable.
Yeah.
I remember at one point I had Dish for a year somewhere, and I had to, if I wanted to have TVW, it didn't cost any extra, but they had to install a second dish on the house.
Great.
So I didn't.
Well, Mike gave us some numbers from the last event, and it was significant. I forget what they were offhand, but it was good.
Well, that would probably be something good for us to mention in the next newsletter.
Yeah, I have that information somewhere.
What is that? Oh, it's that.
Okay, I think I've got everything I need here. Luis, I've got your comments, and so I think I'm ready to go.
Pretty basic.
Yeah. Hey, after we do this 6 times, you guys, we finally get it down, you know.
Oh yeah.
Oh, we're doing pretty well. And by the way, we have 32 people signed up. Now, some of that includes the speakers. But it's a good number.
Harvey, you've missed a lot of the fun of this East-West group. I tell you, it's been an active group, to say the least.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons why I just feel I can't continue as president. Is that since I'm not participating in one of our biggest things, it's like that's a good sign. It's time to do something different. I'm actually hoping to try to motivate Blaine back into existence, but it's really going to have to depend a little bit to see what happens with restoration of the Cascades after the reductions for COVID.
Yeah.
If that, I might focus on that a little more, but then after that, I'm thinking about trying to focus on Blaine. That's the current low-hanging fruit. I think that would be such a valuable infill station.
At our meeting on Saturday, I'm going to make, if there's a moment available, I'd like to make a little pitch to have more of our board members participate in this East-West project, because to me, it almost feels like a full-time job. There's so many.
I understand what you mean. I would suggest you come up with some very specific things that you would like to ask people to take on as a role. So basically positions on the committee with responsibilities. That's something that's coming up in general about our description of what our board might be best served by doing. And I think in microcosm, the same thing would be true of your committee.
Hello, Barry. How are you? Welcome.
I'm here, Charlie. I don't know if you can hear me. I've got some glitches here.
Yes.
Okay, at least that's a start, but I'm here.
Very good. And we just got bad news from Dave Stromeier from Missoula. He will not be able to attend tonight. He has his mother is very ill in Gresham, Oregon.
I knew it was in Oregon is where she was.
Yeah. So.
Hey, this is Luis. Hi, Barry.
Hi, Luis.
Do you think you could maybe give a little backdrop on what Stromeier might have been talking about, at least in terms of the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority, just to fill that spot, just off the cuff?
Boy, yeah, if I can find it quick enough, I know which one it is.
Barry, it's toward the end of the event, so it'll be close to 8 o'clock. So
Okay.
you've got some time to look it up. I
Okay.
mean, he's got a bunch of stuff on the website, so I would think you could pull some of that out.
Okay.
That'd be great.
Yeah, throw in some RPA stuff too. We've got to make sure we get the word out to all the people that are working on this.
I think we only gave him like 5 minutes, so it's not like there's a lot of time
Yeah.
Okay.
needed. And Eva from TVW says they are carried on Comcast if anyone is curious.
Mm-hmm. Good to know.
We've already put the link to the TVW stream on our website, so in case anybody asks, it's on the All Aboard website. Barry, I'm going to forward you the email from Dave Stromeier, which
Okay.
has some of the things that he suggested that we could say.
Okay.
So I'm going to forward that to you right now.
All right. I'll look for that, Charlie.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Charlie, did you ever see anything back from Pate about what he might be talking about tonight?
No, he did not. So any discussion that was had with you.
Is he
Yeah,
going to be on for the full meeting? Do you know, Luis?
Well, he better be, but I have no idea.
Because there's some good material on here that
Absolutely.
would be nice to have him here.
Yeah, he needs to hear that for definitely.
Abe has done some really remarkable work there. We need to figure out how we're going to get this advertised all around Central and Eastern Washington. Well, Western
Yeah,
Washington.
his work just blew me away. I mean, that's incredible. And that's the kind of stuff I wouldn't even call that a deep dive. I mean, he's doing his best to talk in near layman's terms about some very significant things.
Have you seen his presentation, Harvey? Harvey, have you seen his presentation, Abe's? You're muted. You're muted.
Yep, I know. I was working on something else and I heard your question. It's like, flip back to that. The presentation that was part of the last event?
No, this is Abe's refined numbers that he has about 30 minutes on the program this evening that he's going to explain. It's quite impressive, I think.
Okay, well,
And
I'll
good
be looking
evening.
forward to that.
Ron Pate is just joining us.
Okay.
Good evening, Ron.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Let me test my video here too. I'm assuming. Does that work?
There you
A
are.
little light background, but it works, right?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. Well, I'm going to eat a cracker or two, and then we'll get going.
Okay, very good.
Good evening, boys. This is Lloyd from Olympia.
Hi,
Good evening,
Lloyd.
Lloyd.
Hi, Lloyd.
Welcome, Lloyd.
And welcome to Paul Bright.
One of the nice things about these virtual meetings is you can smoke and drink. But I want you to know, I'll try not to do it on screen, okay? And if I do need a quick, I'm drinking a ginger beer, okay? It's just a green bottle.
Okay. So if you disappear like this, is that
Call my partner.
Yeah, I had a can of sparkling water I was going to bring down, but then I realized it looked too much like a beer. It's liquid death, sparkling water. I think I shouldn't do that. I'll keep my pencil cup out of view also.
Oh, there's Barkus. He's not going to be at our meeting.
And I'm going to mute everyone until you're ready to speak. And good evening to those who've just joined. We will be starting in 2 minutes. And good evening and welcome to the All Aboard Washington train trek to Spokane and beyond. Let us introduce Harvey Bowen, our All Aboard Washington board chair, and then he will introduce the rest of the group.
Thank you, Charlie. Welcome, everyone, to tonight's train trek to Spokane and beyond. I'm Harvey Bowen, board president of All Aboard Washington, and I'm glad to see the online participants tonight and also to welcome later viewers watching recordings of this event. It's my honor to introduce Gary Wirt of Yakima, Washington. Gary is an All Aboard Washington board member and vice president of All Aboard Washington, who has been focusing his volunteering on our efforts to add and expand passenger rail services in Eastern Washington. He leads our board committee focused on supporting the efforts of the state legislature to research a proposed restoration of service between Western Washington and Spokane via the Stampede Pass Tunnel, Kittitas Valley, Yakima Valley, and Tri-Cities. Gary.
Thank you, Harvey. As Harvey said, I live in Yakima. I'm retired from the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Aviation Administration, which of course has nothing to do with trains. However, Central Washington had Amtrak service until October 1981, when the Empire Builder was rerouted over Stevens Pass. Yakima County has a population of 250,000, and it now has the distinction of being the largest metropolitan area in the state of Washington without passenger rail service. Frankly, the transportation options here in Yakima are limited. The local interest, however, is very high, and I hope I can continue to be helpful in this effort. I would now like to introduce Mr. Luis Moscoso. Luis is All Aboard Washington's Government Affairs Director, and Luis is former co-vice chair of the Washington State House of Representatives Transportation Committee. He is also the co-founder of the Legislative Rail Caucus. Luis. You are muted, Luis.
Got it. Thank you, Gary, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful adventure we started. I'm here to introduce our speakers, and the first one we're going to have is Ron Pate, who's the director of the Rail, Freight, and Ports Division at Washington State Department of Transportation. Ron has been a great friend of All Aboard Washington, has advised us for years about how to work more closely with his department and with the legislature. And tonight, Ron is going to give us a sort of a picture of the issues right now that he faces in the rail division and the legislature with funding, COVID, and other things that have really brought so many things to a stop in the face of trying to expand the intercity rail service. We have to take a good, cold, hard look at the situation as it is right now on the ground. So with that, Mr. Pate, it's all yours.
Thank you, Luis. I think you can all see me. Is that correct? Everything's working fine. Got some nods. Great. Great to be here tonight. Thanks for putting this together. I'm really flattered by my younger picture you put up of me, so that makes me feel good. It looks back at the younger days. Like Luis said, there's a lot going on with rail nationally, and certainly at the state level, that I think it's a good opportunity to let folks know, what's going on, what we're trying to do, how we're working with other states across the country that as part of the service, that state-supported routes that, they're nationally recognized as routes that states have to pay for those services using Amtrak as the operator. Before we go there, I'll take a couple minutes. There are some great things going on with our capital investment programs for rail. It's, freight side. The PCC system got secured federal build grants leveraging the legislative money that was given to Washington. We're always trying to find opportunities. We're also continuing to develop those landslide mitigation projects and leverage more federal funds. Everyone probably knows we did receive some CRISI grant in 2017 to build more of those projects. BNSF is putting in hard, cold cash with those projects with us. And we also received federal grants to replace the Amtrak Cascades equipment that was lost in the derailment and has been now taken out of service. With that said, what I wanted to talk a little bit to is on the freight rail side, freight railroads right now are certainly experiencing issues from COVID financially, crews, managing their systems. It would probably be helpful at some point to have maybe one of those gentlemen like Johan Hellman talk about, things that BNSF is having to work through. There's some very challenging times. Now to focus on the Cascades itself, I want to talk a little bit about then and now. So in 2019, we were having a pretty record year. You have to keep in mind, we worked through a very tragic derailment, but service responded very quickly. We saw ridership upticks. We were having almost record ridership in 2019. Our costs were very low. We worked on fare box recovery, meaning we were paying for about 60%, 62% of the service based on that ridership, tickets purchased. In 2020, we are running only 25%, I should say Amtrak's running about 25% of our service. Right now, there's one trip between Seattle and Portland and another trip that goes Eugene to Portland. Demand has decreased to 90% less of what it was in 2019. And we've lost about 95% of those revenues that you would see on those trains. That is not a good picture. Washed out with many other states around the country, have worked with Amtrak, working with our federal delegation partners to try to get some federal help for this and federal recognition that we do need some help as state-supported routes, as well as Amtrak. Amtrak was successful in getting $239 million for 28 state-supported routes. That CARES Act funding is allocated by a formula through Amtrak. So Amtrak actually receives the money. And state costs are capped at about 80% of what they were in 2019. But with that said, you have to realize our revenues are down. So we are losing a significant amount of money every month that goes by. We also recognize, we're working with the FRA on this and other states as well, that the way the federal legislation was written, at the federal fiscal year, that money could go away if there's any remaining money. Right now, Amtrak does feel there could be some remaining money that could be allocated maybe through November or December. But if it doesn't get, if it can't be moved federally, if there's legislation or laws around that money it could go away end of the federal fiscal year, which is September 30th. We do think there would be a path forward, though, working with FRA. We've had many conversations with them because we do need to have that continued support, both Washington, Oregon, and all the other states. Another thing we're trying to do is control costs where we can. Amtrak's position is that about 80% of those costs are fixed costs. They don't decrease. You can certainly imagine if Amtrak's on the line, they know this to be true. States and them are having many conversations weekly about this and what can be done differently to help make sure that services are secured and are prepared to come back to those normal levels once we get through the pandemic. We're looking at everything you can imagine. We don't want to discontinue service completely. We do have some federal obligations. I can tell you we've met with FRA directly. I don't have any indication from the federal government that they're going to take back money. They realize 28 states are in the same position. Costs are far exceeding revenues, and there's just no pot of money. Specifically in Washington State, one of our main challenges is I-976 that was passed. That kind of took money from the multimodal fund, which directly funds the Amtrak Cascades. That account is not in a good status at all. So we're doubly challenged beyond the pandemic in Washington State. We are, like I said, doing everything we can to see what we can do to lower costs. As far as Amtrak Cascades equipment right now, with no demand of service, there's not a lot of demand for equipment. And in fact, I know we've talked to other states around the country, Illinois, for example, in the Midwest State Coalition. They're getting brand new passenger rail equipment. If you all will remember, that was secured through federal grants. That's being delivered right now. I got some pretty cool pictures of it in the Chicago yard. And, a lot of states are trying to release equipment so they don't have to continue to pay for it. So that's another challenge, a logistics challenge nationally. Also, everyone on this call probably is aware that Amtrak nationally is discontinuing long distance service. That's another thing we are trying to understand. How does that impact the Cascades with less daily service of long distance service? what are those cost implications? Because as we all know, everything's connected. When something happens to one service, something could happen to another. And we want to make sure that there's no cost shifts that are unexpected. We want to make sure that if there's loss of ridership at those services, that how is it going to impact our service? Or is there an opportunity to do something creative with a limited service that could tie into our Cascade service and really get our ridership up? We are working very hard to get as much ridership as we can. And then the last thing, I'll touch on Point Defiance Bypass a little bit. Everyone on this call is familiar about us trying to get the trains back on the bypass. I can tell you Sound Transit is working very hard with Amtrak and others to get through a process to allow trains to run back on that bypass. And I should say allow Amtrak trains. There is already a freight service that runs on the bypass, very limited freight service, but there is some. So there's certainly a lot of challenges with that. As you know, Sound Transit did an independent review of their program, and they're following that advice they got from that independent review very, very closely. And I can say we've got a great working relationship. They want to make sure that Amtrak meets all the requirements needed to run the trains back on the bypass. So I don't have a date for you. I don't have a time, but for perspective, I mean, that should be thought as a different process than the funding. I mean, certainly to get back to the round trips we had or get to the 6 round trips, funding is an issue. But if we're running 1 train or 10 trains, getting back on the bypass would certainly be something we'd be interested, in supporting and doing in the future. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, Luis.
And feel free to add questions to the chat. If you are not familiar with it, it'll be in the black menu. There will be an option for chat in there. And so feel free to ask your questions there.
Yeah, Charlie will be reading those chat questions. Of course, we can see them if it's sent to everyone, or if you want to just send it individually to someone. I know that one thing that we've come up with before, and I hear it all the time, and Ron, you're on the spot as usual. People are asking about the replacement equipment for the derailment, and there's a lot of confusion out there. Is there any clarification that you can offer at this time about what is happening in that matter?
Yeah, I can tell you, as WashDOT committed to and Amtrak committed to, the Series 6 have been taken out of service as of June 30th. They are out of service. I can't tell you about the sales process because it was a competitive bid process, and that's still ongoing should be wrapped up soon. Right now, the demand for equipment for anyone is very low. There is a proposal. It would even add more costs onto the service. So from a perspective of funding, let me share this. I'm an appointing authority in the state. I have state laws I have to follow. I cannot, by state law, exceed my budget. One of the things right now, one of the biggest challenges, and it's a challenge for the state of Oregon as well. If you project out the costs, the expenses of the Amtrak that continually are going up, it feels like, and you look at, legislative session coming up, possible funding, the status of the account, it's very challenging to even consider asking for any other funding, especially significant funding for equipment. I think from our perspective, the best plan right now is we do have some Amtrak equipment. It's cleared to run on the tracks just as all the other trains have run. We do have plans for new equipment. We have the federal grants. We've got about, I think, $75 million in total of funding to provide new equipment that once that national procurement is done, the CEO of Amtrak also has written us a letter. We're the first to get that equipment. So I just think the answer to the question, Luis, is there's equipment everywhere right now in the United States that's not running. And so for WashDOT or Oregon to sign up for something, and I'll speak specifically for WashDOT, that adds a tremendous amount of cost when equipment wouldn't be used in service would be a very challenging thing to do. And it would be very hard to get support right now for that. I think we're agnostic to types of equipment. The Secretary has been very clear, as long as it meets our performance requirements, our financial requirements, it meets FRA requirements and all safety requirements, we're agnostic to it, but it also has to fit within our existing budgets. And we've been clear from the start about that.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Ron. I know we've heard some of that before, but it's good to kind of get that out there for the listening public to understand just the challenges that you face. We've got 3 other questions that have come in, and I'll try to read them as they might relate to what you just said. The first one is WashDOT going to fund an extra Seattle to Portland trip on the days if when the Coast Starlight does not run?
Okay, let me, there's no plan for that. I can tell you that, and I can assure you. And when you say WashDOT funds, I want to be really clear, because I'm sure there's also legislators on this call. WashDOT doesn't come up with funding and do things with it. We follow legislative direction. They, you know, when we develop a list of projects for the PCC system or our FRAP program, right, that they've been very good about funding, we develop recommendations that go to them. We do not determine it's funded. So I want to be clear about that. I have no authority to say we're going to support or backfill a long distance train. I think other states would have concerns with that as well. We do not want to get in a position, you know, under the 209 policy, any train less than 750 miles, states have to pay for. And state budgets are very challenged. If long distance routes are broken up under that 750 miles, believe me, we're paying close attention to it. And I don't think any states right now would agree that they can just absorb more costs. They've been very clear. In fact, they can't. We need to figure out a way to make costs that are reflective of what the actual service is. And that's a daily conversation with states and Amtrak right now.
Right, even going to 3 days a week service, you know, between the Coast Starlight and the Empire Builder, you know, how will they ever make the right kind of connections to move people along and not have them stranded somewhere, let's say in Portland, you know, or Seattle to make those connections? That's not a question right now. It's just one of the challenges that we have to look at. Another question is, have we talked to Burlington Northern about what an eventual return to service looks like? And I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, you know, DJ Mitchell, everybody on this call probably knows, we have regular conversations with them about, you know, what the returns of service looks like. They operate Sounder service for Sounder. They're plugged into all those meetings and calls, and they know the return to service on the bypass. There's a lot of things that the host railroad has to work through, so they're aware.
Right. And the last question we'll take here is probably a little deeper dive into the financial situation. And how do you see the impact of Initiative 976 and legal challenges to that affecting the budget and the multimodal?
Yeah, so the agency as a whole, all our multimodal divisions, you have public transportation, active transportation, rail, freight, and ports. And keep in mind, the Cascades is one piece of this program. They are looking at this very closely, but there's nothing to tell the department or the agency that 976 is going to be overturned or not. So we have to proceed as it is law right now. So that's absolutely what we're doing, because we certainly can't be in a position that we don't, and then we've overexpended things. So we're being very mindful of everything. And like I said, with COVID on top of it, it really complicates it and makes it a much more critical situation.
Right. It's just good to hear that so that people can understand just the complicated situation that we're in. And as rail advocates ourselves, you know, when we ask for things, we don't want to just ask for it in a vacuum. We understand that it has to be part of the larger, you know, legislative, you know, funding system, as well as with working with the federal government in order to get anything done. So thank you for your time, Ron. I hope you stick around and can listen to the rest of it. Sounds like there'll be some more interesting things, especially when we talk about the next piece, which is our response, you know, to the study for the East-West feasibility study.
Okay.
With that, then go ahead.
I will mute and turn off my audio. Thank you for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. With that, I'm going to introduce Abe Zumalt, a longtime member of All Aboard Washington and currently a board member, having returned to the Northwest. He is a transportation analyst with R.L. Banks and Associates, and also had worked with Rail Passage Association in Washington, D.C. before that last job. So Abe, take it away.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm seeing nods. Yeah. So first of all, thank you for that thorough update, Ron. We all really appreciate the hard work you're doing in an increasingly challenging environment. So that was really helpful. As Luis mentioned, my day job is an associate at the nation's oldest railroad consulting firm, R.L. Banks and Associates. It's a venerable firm that does work that few other kinds of railroad consulting firms do. We often negotiate access to Class I railroads on behalf of shippers and municipalities in the interest of expanding transit service. The firm also produced an influential study calculating the economic benefits of the empire builder in Montana, elements of which I'm going to borrow from today. I'm also nominally serving as a board member of All Aboard Washington, and I'm really pleased in this instance to do some pro bono work in service of an important part of the future of Washington State. Today, I'm going to basically talk about how passenger trains have benefited Washington State, and also why it's essential that they still can benefit the state, even in the time of this pandemic. We're going to start with placing the service in the context of the time of COVID-19, which I believe is the elephant in the room and essential that we name it. We're going to then walk through the draft benefits of east-west service between Seattle and Spokane from inputs derived by Steer, another consulting firm which completed the feasibility study for that service. And in the process of that, I'm going to walk you through the benefits methodology that I employed to arrive at the numbers that I did, which I'm then going to turn on the historic performance of the Cascade service, where today you'll be introduced to a broad number that I believe represents some of the ways that the service has benefited the state over the last few years. And then finally, kind of a blueprint of how we might be able to grow these dividends going into the future. So on to the next slide, please. To start, it's really important, as I said before, to name the elephant in the room of the present pandemic that has greatly impacted almost every facet of our daily lives, including our transit services. If you haven't seen Amtrak's excellent video in that screenshot, you ought to seek it out because they've really been up to the task here. And I'm certainly not one to hold criticism, but they've done a great job. Starting on a personal note, I had to move my wife and myself from Washington, D.C. to Seattle in the course of the pandemic. And we didn't just take the train because we both like to ride it. The train simply made the most sense in terms of the things that we could bring on board, but also in knowing that the mask policies would be uniformly enforced. Unlike at the nation's gasoline chains and motels and uneven policies across states. We made better time than if we were driving, and it made the whole process easy. Easy enough, as some of you may remember, to present at the Yakima meeting for All Aboard Washington from our bedroom on the train, traveling at 80 miles an hour in the middle of Montana. Some of these numbers you actually may recognize from that presentation. But this is all to say that while restoring confidence is key, we're really fortunate that in some ways it's virtually the biggest thing that has to be done in terms of rail service for the practices currently in place and maintain its position as perhaps the safest mode of overland travel available to Americans. It's really ironic that in a time of great need, we face a potential loss of an option essential to many in the form of Amtrak's own proposed reductions to its national network trains, like the Empire Builder and Coast Starlight, but also some pending threats to our own homegrown service. As many listening already know, rail planning cycles can last for decades. Depending on your accepted timeline, this means that the course of multiple pandemics could be consumed in preparing the next iteration of improved passenger rail service. It's not a question of if we'll need it. Paraphrasing from the Rail Passengers Association President and CEO Jim Matthews, not all workers are knowledge workers. Not all knowledge workers are introverts. Not all travel is commuting, and not all travelers have a choice. Not all riders will permanently fear travel. It is therefore more a question of if we have the sagacity to plan for the inevitability that we will need intercity passenger rail service. This is not the new normal. This is wartime against an invisible enemy. Retooling for a post-war boom needs to start now or as soon as possible. So moving on to the next slide, you may recognize.
Excuse me, Abe?
Oh, yes?
Yeah, Luis, I'm not seeing any slides. I'm wondering if anybody else is seeing anything.
I just got a thumbs up from Gary. Is anybody else
Yes.
having problems?
Yes, we are seeing something.
Yeah.
Huh. I wonder why I'm only seeing you.
It might be
Okay.
Check it out. Well, yeah.
probably your shared screen with the video button in the upper right-hand corner of your presentation screen. But
Oh, go ahead. Keep going.
no
I'll
problem.
figure it out.
So this is really a response to, so 200,000 passengers Steer came up with as a number between people running between Seattle and Spokane. And what does that mean, 200,000 passengers on that corridor? I mean, really, what it means are pretty good return numbers for a small percentage of the overall trips taken between Eastern and Western Washington. We're talking about 15, for the operations costs that they contemplated of between 50 and 30 million, we're looking at perhaps 33 to 36 million dollars in state savings from car trips diverted. We're looking at maybe $7 million in visitor spending that didn't exist before. We're looking at some significant pollution abatement costs, and we're also looking at some airfare saved that Washington state residents currently shell out for. Now, how can we say this? Let's go to the next slide. Initial Steer estimates of the East-West ridership only considered diverted automotive trips, but that's pretty good actually, because the cost savings of avoided vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, as I'm going to refer to it for the bulk of this presentation, is really vastly underappreciated. Like fish in water, general American transportation policy has largely spoken from quote unquote behind the wheel of a car, and therefore does not appreciate just how terrifically expensive driving is. There is a vast amount of research that would allow a more in-depth analysis of how saving Washingtonians from unnecessary VMTs could benefit the state in myriad ways. But for expediency, we'll use an average figure developed by some of our respected neighbors to the north at the Victoria Transportation Policy Institute. That's on the next slide. So in association with the American Association of Highway and Transportation Officials and some numbers that they produce in their bottom line report, VTPI was able to arrive at a pretty astonishing number. It's $2 for every vehicle mile traveled in an automobile that you save. And this is kind of an insight into how fantastically expensive our roads are and how expensive maintaining them is. 12 cents is an extremely conservative estimation of costs incurred from tens of thousands of fatalities that occur each year on American roads, and most studies price it far higher than that. And finally, if drivers switch to a train, carbon emissions are slashed roughly in half. What's interesting about this is if we go to the next slide, Washington state can somewhat pat itself on the back because it has actually been, its importance has been recognized by Washington state laws. We're supposed to be aiming towards an 18% drop this year, which I'm sure the pandemic actually may have contributed towards some progress in that goal. But by 2035, we're supposed to be 30% down from where we were in 2006 and 50% by 2050. Are we going to follow these goals? I would argue that adherence to the rail program is a strong indicator of whether we will or we won't. VMT reduction goals are really logistical objectives. What alternatives will be made available to ensure people can do this without compromising their livelihoods and their individual pursuits of happiness? Really, Cascades and East-West Rail Service can help us in this. If we go on to the next slide, one of the issues with the way that Steer presented their information is the fact that they did not give us, they only gave us a bulk ridership number of either about 191,000 or 205,000 passengers, depending on whether or not we had one train a day or two trains a day between Seattle and Spokane. However, we developed from the Steer report the hypothetical number of VMTs saved by prospective East-West service. The report provided this map of origin destination points from the survey it conducted, which serves as a model of how ridership may fluctuate throughout the corridor. And so we multiplied the Spokane to Seattle ridership as one of these given percentages for an estimate of ridership between a given origin destination pair. So if we go to the next slide, if we conceptualize in the impacts from in-state travel, estimates must be made as to how passengers would use the corridor. If we, pardon me 1 second, lost my place there. The results from the survey Steer consulted were made available, which provided a general origin destination framework. And what's interesting is that if we multiply these passenger numbers in the next slide, by the overall amount of contemplated VMT reduction savings, we arrive at a pretty astonishing number, about $33.5 million in road wear and tear, plus savings from responses to highway and statistical deaths, arrives at that number. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that per National Transportation Statistics, cars generally produce about 371 grams per carbon dioxide passenger mile, and trains are at about 177. Pricing carbon dioxide grams in such a conservative way, so conservative that my unborn grandchildren will probably want to beat me with sticks, arrives at a different number. Speaking of underestimation, given time, reams could be written about what we're not capturing. Not only is the price per CO2 gram extremely conservative, we haven't breached issues such as particulate emissions, which are even caused by the wear of tires on asphalt surfaces, which have caused known health problems, nor, especially of importance in Washington state, of water runoff pollution issues, which are all contributed to significantly by automobiles, but not by trains. And so if you go to the next slide, even by these conservative calculations, we're looking at about, $360,000 or $370,000 a year saved in pollution abatement expense. Again, not accounting for myriad other factors of great importance to the state, again, like wastewater runoff. However, if we go to the next slide, what's interesting about the ridership calculations for the east-west passenger rail service between Seattle and Spokane is that they contemplated only passenger trips diverted from cars. Now, this doesn't reflect Amtrak's own data regarding ridership in Washington state. If you go to the next slide, we can see that according to Amtrak's own data, 47% of passengers drive, while 32% would fly, indicating a preference over vastly faster planes on every corridor. 10% only would take a bus instead, really settling the idea that a train is substitutable with a bus in any sort of circumstance. And 11%, remarkably more than the bus estimate, wouldn't travel at all. Looking at a steer estimate with Amtrak's own numbers would indicate that the ridership projections were perhaps understated by half. The reality almost certainly isn't as extreme as that, but there is clearly room to question the idea that ridership would only come from would-be car trips. If we go to the next slide, I want to focus on passengers who would not travel. Now it sounds awfully funny to say passengers who would not travel, but it's a true effect. There are a significant portion of Amtrak passengers that would not make trips that they do without train service. As with all consumer choices, there are myriad reasons as to why this is, but it speaks to the unique qualities of train travel. Note again that they are not interchangeable with buses. If we go to the next slide, we can see that these passengers are really quite valuable. Every day tripper on average is worth $84 to wherever they're stopping off in the state. Every overnight visitor to Washington state or within the state is worth $366. These are brand new numbers coming from Experience Washington, which thankfully our tourist board is up and running this year thanks to an action by Jay Inslee last year. So if we apply the same ridership matrix to these numbers in the next slide, we can see some pretty remarkable numbers for each place that this train would stop. To be clear, this is just an exercise. If the steer ridership numbers conform with Amtrak's ridership data and 11% of their gross figures were induced. Assuming the steer schedules were also employed, precluding day trips in the big markets, this means that everybody would be overnighting. One train a day in this exercise would be capable of creating almost $8 million in induced visitor spending. Note that over $1 million of that is in Spokane specifically, from only, again, a few thousand riders, because we're only talking about 11% of the projected ridership here. Given the presence of significant tourist draws on both sides of the mountains, this is an effect that should not simply be disregarded, especially given the presence of this trend locally in Amtrak's own data. Finally, I want to talk about another interesting effect here. Let me go to the next slide. If you look at BTS statistics for airfare, people that ride in planes end up paying about 50 cents per mile. While if you look at Amtrak Cascades fares, that goes down to about 25 cents per mile. So that third of passengers in Washington state who would otherwise fly are saving a lot of money. These prices are averages per mile that passengers spend, and the savings result in a surplus. However, I know that there may be airport people on this call, and it's important to note the dynamic in countries where high capacity or high speed railway systems take part of a short haul air market service. And those services have made more room at airports for vastly more profitable long distance air service connections. So it isn't necessarily at the detriment of either airport on either end of this corridor. If we go to the next slide, we can see that hypothetically, this might save, out of that 200,000 people contemplated, about $8 million a year would be saved from would-be plane tickets. It must be acknowledged, however, that the Steer report anticipated no diversion from airlines to prospective rail service, given the extreme time savings. However, given the historic Cascades performance against hourly Horizon Air flights throughout the entirety of its corridor, managing to derive a third of its ridership from them as per Amtrak's numbers, despite fewer departures and a far longer journey time, it isn't a futile exercise to contemplate this. The only assumption we're making is that potential passengers on the east-west service aren't making drastically different choices than those made by present passengers on Washington's intercity passenger rail system, several thousand of which already originate from eastern Washington. Especially to the Tri-Cities from Spokane, where the projected train service would be faster, this measurement of utility is a boon to Washington state residents and representative of a far different policy than exists today. For Eastern Washingtonians, policy that can be summed up thusly. Please go to the next slide. This is an extreme way to say this, but if you're living on the east side of the Cascades and you can't afford plane tickets, then you better get on your knees and put some tire chains on, because there isn't a better way to cross the Cascades. There isn't a safer way to do it, and there sure isn't a cheaper way. Is this the future we want? It's really no wonder that, if you can go to the next slide, Steer cited 76% support rating for the east-west trains. It's one of the highest rates of public support that they have seen on any sort of community engagement that they've done. The outpouring support for the service is remarkable, especially given the otherwise divided results of our recent state primary. For the price of a few miles of highway, more about that at the end of this presentation, we could have a 400-mile corridor connecting the entire state. This high level of support may come as a surprise, but it really shouldn't be. Because if we look at the same analysis I just performed on the East-West study and put that at Cascades, go to the next slide, please. We can see that the Cascades every year was worth almost $90 million. In 2019, which Ron Pay admittedly said was perhaps the best year that the service had seen, we saw a huge amount of savings. In 2019, by the same limited analysis I subjected Steer's ridership to in the East-West service, the Cascade paid out, what amounts to about a 10% return on the $800 million in capital projects that have benefited it since the 2009 stimulus, and several times what Washington State pays to run it. Consider this against the backdrop of investment in our highway system. Roger Millar's speech at the High Speed Rail Association meeting last year at Microsoft campus referenced the fact that 80% of the Washington State Department of Transportation's budget devoted to highway expansion produced a 1% expansion in total road capacity. In the meantime, our comparatively modest annual investment in passenger rail really pays out for Washingtonians. While being of effective service to the state, however, it has to be said, the old dynamic remains. The passenger trains make plenty of money, but maybe just not for the entities that operate them. If you can go to the next slide. While 2019 was the best year in Cascades history for its fiscal performance, it's interesting to note that this performance has been kind of interestingly consistent for the past decade. At an average of a little less than 800,000 passengers every year, this means the benefits tabulated for 2019 were enjoyed by Washington State for every one of these past years. This means that since 2013, the state has seen perhaps well more than $500 million in indirect benefits from the service. On the flip side, 800,000 passengers, if that seems like a scening for this performance, you're really not wrong. I want to go to the next slide and ask for your forgiveness in the presentation here, because this is a little technical. But if you leave this presentation with only one concept, please make it this one. The frequency of passenger rail service is exponentially related to ridership. This means that for each train added, ridership on all trains see growth, resulting in higher average passenger loads. This is something that customers understand intuitively. If trains run often enough to not consult a schedule or not have to consult a schedule, as in there's one every 15 minutes or every hour in the case of the California services on this chart, like the Pacific Surfliner up there in the top right-hand corner, the utility of the service drastically increases. As frequency grows, the cost of operation also enjoy greater efficiencies over larger numbers of trips, resulting in a virtuous cycle of more passengers and shrinking cost per passenger carried. If it seems as if the cascade again was capped at 800,000 riders, that's because in effect it was. Now this effect cuts both ways. Don't expect the one cascade's frequency now running to provide strong indication of demand returning. Ridership will neither shrink nor grow geometrically. Service will have to be added as a part of the process of restoring convenience and confidence, not as something we can do after the fact. On this chart, you'll see squarely in the middle a point I labeled for the Amtrak Cascade service. The 2006 plan for Cascade's service expansion anticipated that we would be where the Pacific Surfliner is on this chart, at 13 daily frequencies and nearly 3 million riders. Please note that the Cascades is at the base of a steep climb on that curve, and I would argue that it has been at that level, at a level of frequency just under what the bare minimum of offering service throughout a given day would be, therefore enticing an exponential number of passengers to ride it. 4 round trips to Portland has garnered a modicum of success, but 7, it should have been running were it not for the tragic derailment of Train 501 in 2017, including a daily Coast Starlight, would have trains running almost every 2 hours on a given day, and the data points to the fact that there would have been a more than commensurate increase in ridership. Please note the group of trains at the bottom of the curve, running between only 1 and 2 daily frequencies. They are exactly in line with the ridership projected by the STEER report at around 200,000 riders per year. More ambitious service over the mountains to the growing Tri-Cities, the largest population center near the West Coast without a connection to the national rail network, will almost certainly deliver much bigger ridership numbers. Please note that this effect was ignored in the study when considering the fact that the potential east-west service adds a new dimension of rail service at Auburn, Washington, ignored because it, quote, already had sounder service. But from documenting this effect, we know that an increase building upon present service should garner more ridership still. So moving on, in 2006, they projected, again, very heady $3 million annual riders from 13 daily Seattle to Portland round trips and 4 daily trips between Seattle and Vancouver, BC. In the next slide, the setting this prospective ridership to the same analysis would render over $300 million in benefits every year for Washington State. So it's a goal really worth pursuing. Finally, please go to the next slide. Note the level of capital investment for certain projects that we've picked out here, that we've invested in, and sometimes the federal government has helped us out. And note that the east-west projected improvements could perhaps be absorbed by just one of these projects. And so in perspective, for an entirely new corridor across the state, we're not talking about drastically more than what we've already invested. Finally, and most importantly, in the next slide, please. The entire 400-mile rail corridor from east to west, Seattle to Spokane, is about the same price as a sub 10-mile highway project. These 2 highway projects represent half of the $800 million invested in the Cascades corridor. So $800 million seemed like a lot. Just put it in perspective with what we spent on roads. Investment in rail is critical, and as we get more bang for our buck with it, it helps us meet our transportation and climate goals. It's a boon for the economy, and without a network of conventional service, it'll be a lot more difficult to build out the high-speed service that the region will eventually require. There's a lot going on here. You'll forgive me for the meandering narrative, but with that, I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Abe. This is Luis, and I don't see any questions in the chat at this time, so please send them in, or if you're bold enough, turn on your mic and ask Abe directly. But a lot of data there. No questions from anybody? Abe, do you want to say anything else about how we should look at this, or how we can make sure that people get a chance to review this work that you've done for all aboard, and to make it available so that we can have further study by the state and other interested parties?
Certainly. I mean, the presentation will be available after the fact, and I'm happy to talk more about the very basic methods used. We can turn this into a series of one-page articles. The major point from this, though, is the fact that in the grand scheme of what we spend on transportation, these investments are not so great. And overall, I think we need to call attention to what's happening at the federal level. For those, I'm sure many people in this meeting will be aware that the National Transportation Reauthorization for Amtrak and Intercity Passenger Rail service is ongoing as the FAST Act expires this year. And the House, interestingly enough, has already passed a bill for passenger rail reauthorization called the Train Act. The Train Act would solve a lot of problems for us. The Train Act eliminates the cuts that Amtrak has proposed for the long distance network. The Train Act also provides what would be an enormous sum of money that could serve as grants directly to states in service of New Start programs like East-West Rail, as well as sustaining grants for established corridors like the Cascades. And it would certainly be helpful in this time of great need. The issue, of course, is that while the House has passed it, and it was certainly a bipartisan move, it was both Democrats and Republicans voting for that, the Senate has not moved on it. And as soon as the House passed the bill, the Senate essentially went on break. So I would say that at this point, it's a really good idea to look at funding being tossed around at the federal level, because you heard from Ron Pate about our own constrained circumstances here in Washington State. So if you want to know more about that, you can contact anybody at All Aboard Washington. But really, it's about calling the senators and making sure that they adopt something very similar to what the House passed, because it's the best federal rail bill that we've seen probably since the inception of Amtrak in 1971. Well, the bill for Amtrak was 1970, but who's splitting hairs?
Very
So,
good.
Abe, we do have a question from the chat, and I think it's incorrect, actually. It says you forgot to mention intercity buses, just planes and cars. And I know you did discuss buses very briefly, but you might want to bring something more into that.
Certainly. Actually, I think I want to call attention to something a little different. But yeah, no, 10% of Amtrak passengers in Washington State, according to Amtrak's data, would have otherwise taken a bus. The most price sensitive of passengers, most likely, would have done that. There are certain savings. The only problem is that the BTS transportation statistics that I was able to derive airfare from haven't been substantially updated with the new bus services that we've seen, which are the ultra cheap fare bus services. And so I didn't feel that the average number was an accurate representation. And I elected, as it was just 10% of ridership, not given the constrained amount of time I had to put together this analysis to look at that or include it. However, I think it's important to talk about a different kind of intercity bus service, which is the myriad small systems that exist all over municipalities in Washington State. We are very unique in this regard. I was amazed, for instance, at the amount of service you can get if you go to Wenatchee or any number of small towns that actually have very viable, comprehensive services in what would normally be considered rural places that wouldn't have that kind of a service in the United States. I'm sure that all of those small services are going to be negatively impacted by the various fiscal constraints that we are under at the moment. However, I'm very concerned about those because they act as a fascinating feeder system into into what could be a greater intercity passenger rail system. One of the reasons why I'm so convinced that a robust Cascades program is totally essential for eventual ultra high speed service between Seattle and Vancouver, BC, is that it provides a feeder service. Well, I think that small bus systems that we have on the peninsula and and on the eastern side of the mountains could similarly feed a more robust conventional passenger rail system. And I'm sure that those guys aren't getting the attention they need at this point.
Okay, if we don't have any further questions, we will certainly make all of this available online after the meeting. And so let's take a 5-minute break and we will be back at 7:25.
Thank you. Hey, Charlie, a bunch of emails came in after we started. One of them from Larry Crowder saying he doesn't have the Zoom meeting information. So
Okay, I'll send that.
resend that to him. And I got something from Judy Warnick saying that, you know, she can't make it, but thought the Representative Dent will do a good job. But he hasn't come on yet either, has he?
We don't have anybody for the second half.
God damn it. I'm going to call, well, now I just saw Larry just said he found the link and we haven't even sent it to him yet. So,
Okay.
well, I better,
Yeah, no, I did send it earlier.
yeah, I know you did. I would say resend it again. Maybe he thought he has it, and with a note saying, you know, we're looking forward to him speaking, because we'll have to bring him up early. I'm going to call Leah, since I've got his private number, and just see what's going on there if we can't get him involved. And I don't know about Heck what to do with that. So do you have a contact for Heck? If you could call Denny after you send the message off to Crowder, I will call Leas, and we'll worry about Dent later, I guess.
Yeah. I do not have his information. All I have is his person.
His what?
Oh, Liz is coming on. Liz is coming on.
Oh, good. Do we have any? What does our screen say right now?
I have his text, first campaign.
Okay, for Heck. Why don't you text that to me? I'll give him a call. You're busy with some other stuff.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
the coronavirus issue, you may reach us at area code 509-607-0156. Again, that number is 509-607-0156. Thank you for calling. Have a nice day.
You might want to mute yourself, Luis.
Ooh, yeah. Sorry. Well, are we ready to start?
Yes, we are. Go ahead, Luis.
Okay, our next presenter is Congressman Denny Heck. Mr. Heck is my congressman down in the 10th Congressional District. We've talked before about issues relating to the Amtrak Cascades in Washington State, and know that Congressman Heck has an interest in transportation and infrastructure economic development. So, Congressman, can you please tell us what you are aware of regarding passenger rail in Washington State and the rest of the country and the need to do so? Thank you.
You're welcome. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. And for all of you members, your members who are listening, he does a great job for you. Trust me, when he says we've talked about this, he makes it known on your behalf. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. Indeed, I want to thank you for the working relationship that we've had during the time that I've been in Congress. And I guess I want to focus on those two things that I've been most involved in as it relates to passenger rail in Washington State and in the nation. And that's, of course, passenger safety and service expansion. We simply can't talk about passenger safety without reflecting on where we were December 18th, 2017. I was sitting in my office and I received word first on national cable news about the accident in DuPont of the Cascade 501. My world came to a stop, literally, at that very moment. And it was not very long after, unfortunately, that I learned that both Jim and Zach were on that train and were two of the three fatalities. Of course, I knew them both. I knew Jim because he'd been in my office several times advocating on behalf of all aboard Washington and doing a great job of it. They were also both my constituents, I might add. That wasn't the only person in this small world that I was connected to on that particular train. A young 18-year-old woman named Maddie was there. She was very severely injured. In fact, lots of bones broken. She happens to be the niece of somebody who has been on my staff from the very day I was sworn in. So this triggered in me not just an additional commitment, but an involvement and an engagement in the issue of passenger safety. You all know that the National Transportation Safety Board did a thorough analysis of all this and came up with some key recommendations coming out of the accident. I took those recommendations and put them into bill form, the Passenger Train Safety Act, 6066, which we were later able to successfully amend into the Moving America Forward bill, which passed the House here a month or two ago and now sits over in the Senate. And it basically picked up on the recommendations of the National Transportation Safety Board and put them into law, which is where they belong. But I also got involved in something else called the Ending Passenger Rail Arbitration. As you may or may not know, after that accident, Amtrak moved to limit the rights of passengers to be made whole in the instance of an accident that was not of their fault. Basically what they did is say, we're going to send you to arbitration. In other words, we're reducing your rights, take it or leave it. Of course, the downside to that is you take away a pretty powerful incentive that people stay focused on safety because of the threat of liability. If you think you might get sued and have to pay, maybe you're paying more attention to making sure that the passengers are safe on that train. This too was included in the Moving America Forward Act, and we're hoping that we can make more progress on it as we move forward. So that's passenger safety. I've also been involved in advocating steadfastly for service expansion. That very same bill that those other two bills were made a part of, the Moving America Forward bill, included a $55 billion investment in passenger rail in this country, long overdue because we've let it atrophy and we all know it. It will add capacity, it will reduce congestion, it will improve repair of rail lines throughout the country. I do think that we ought to put an asterisk next to this and remind ourselves that as big as the needs are in the Northeast corridor, we need to make sure we're advocating to get ours, to get our fair share, because we have passenger rail needs in the Northwest and in Washington State too. There is a lot that we can do to improve the situation. I am enamored of the idea of the proposal for a daytime east-west train out of Spokane. And that's probably for a lot of reasons. The first of which is Spokane's our second home. My wife Paula is from Spokane. All her family is there. We have business interest in Spokane. We're there a lot. And I think it would be a very good thing for the economy of the region and the state. And I also think if you step back, it's a bit emblematic of the kind of thing we can do to bind our state together more closely. You know, there's this kind of goofy movement about the eastern part of the state seceding and creating its own state. That's not going to happen. But it does speak to the need for us all to work a little harder about integrating the East and the West. And the East-West Day train from Spokane could be a part of that. So these are the things that I've been involved in during my time in Congress and working with all aboard Washington. If I have the opportunity to become Lieutenant Governor, you have a sense of what my values are and what my commitment is, and that when there is a need that I see, I spring to action. And I promise and pledge to you that the same would be the case if I am fortunate enough to be elected Lieutenant Governor. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Congressman, this is Luis again. Thank you for what you presented today. How do you really see yourself as a champion for intercity passenger rail? I'm glad you support the idea, but as you know, somewhat like what's happened at the national level, there has been, we haven't really achieved all the things that our initial legislation and some RCWs say we should have gotten done with the Cascades by this time. And of course, now with the fiscal constraints, it'll even be harder. But don't you see that we need almost a reset, a new way of pushing the Cascades as part and parcel of the economic development and restoration of service throughout the state?
Absolutely, Luis. And I think that the way to think about this is, what is the opportunity that is in front of us? Look, we're in the soup here, my friends, and nobody should characterize this as anything other than it is. We have the COVID crisis, we have an economic recession, and as you alluded to, Luis, we have a tremendous budget challenge, perhaps the biggest in 40 years since the 1981-83 biennium. But that can also present opportunity. We have a need to rebuild the economy better than before. And the truth of the matter is, in every recession that we've encountered in modern history, part of the workout plan was a significant increase in public infrastructure. Well, rail service, passenger rail service, is a part of infrastructure. We also have a need, as we all know, to deal with climate change and to get people out of their automobiles and into mass transit. Passenger rail is a part of the solution to that. And so I think we should look upon these things as opportunities and how we can take advantage of what it is before us to actually begin to move the chains down the field. I'm optimistic.
Thank you for that. We're going to have to borrow all what you just said and use it ourselves and trying to get the word out to people. Thank you so much. Any other questions from anyone on the line? I don't see anything in the chat at this time. If not, I don't know if you or your staff had a chance to see the first part of our presentation, Congressman, but we had a really good overview from Ron Pate from WSDOT, and very sobering information we got out of that, which I'm sure you're probably aware of anyway. And that's part of the challenge all the board faces, is in educating a public that hasn't been paying as much attention to what intercity passenger rail could be doing, and trying to get them to understand how we're going to prioritize the budget going forward next year with such a reduced revenue. So any other ideas you may have, and other legislators, we'd be glad to hear that as we try to figure out how to help the state move this transportation modality forward. Thank you. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Mark's hand raised a minute ago.
Oh, thank you, Harvey. For those of you who've never heard Denny speak before, I think you can tell why we here in the 10th District are so proud to have him as our member of Congress. Sad to lose you in DC, but great hopes for your future here, and looking forward to that too. It's been a great friendship all these years, Denny. And besides that, we share a birthday.
July 29th. Thank you, Mayor Fouch, very much. Luis, can I ask you to get me the presentation that was presented to you through maybe Kelty? I think you were in contact with her.
Yes,
I would love.
We'll send that to you.
Thank you very much.
Not a
Thank
problem.
you all very much for your time.
Thanks again, Congressman. Our next presenter is Senator Marco Leas, another young man I've known for a long time, even before he was in the legislature. He is the majority floor leader for the Democrats in the Senate. He's a former co-vice chair of the House Transportation Committee that I worked with when I was being brought on to the Transportation Committee some years back. Senator Leas, good to have you here. Can you please tell us your impression of what you've been hearing tonight?
Yeah, great to be with you. And particularly, Luis, you and I used to be neighbors up here in Snohomish County. So it's so wonderful to see you engaged and continuing to press forward on rail. You were such a leader as vice chair of the Transportation Committee on rail issues. I'm glad that all the board has roped you in to help with this important task moving forward. My journey of rail started really over a decade ago for two reasons. My family is from Finland originally, and so I've had a chance to visit them several times over the years, my grandparents and my aunts and uncles. And obviously intercity rail in Scandinavia is a well-established way of moving around. And then in 2009, I had the chance to visit Spain as part of a delegation with Senator Mary Margaret Haugen and lawmakers from half dozen states as the Obama administration was beginning to invest in passenger rail, and to see what a transformation that high-speed rail and intercity rail have brought to the Spanish economy, growing literally cities out of nothing, where there was just a crossroads. Now there's a city with 100, 200,000 people because of those rail investments. So I think there's a real potential here to think about rail as a way to grow our economy, to create jobs in every corner of our state. And then as we face the existential threat of climate change, it also gives us an opportunity to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, address the health of our planet, and solve a lot of problems all at once. So I was really proud to serve alongside Luis in the House when we invested nearly $1 billion of Recovery Act funds in improving our travel times along the existing Amtrak corridor, and excited to have built off of that in conversations both in the 2015 revenue package to continue those investments, and as we think about a future investment to really become visionary about what the potential is here and finding solutions that will help us really bring that travel time between Vancouver and Seattle down to an hour, and from Seattle to Portland down to an hour with truly high-speed rail. And I just want to start by saying how much I admire Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's plan on this point. If you look at the Build Back Better program at the federal level, I think it gives the infrastructure of what we need as we improve rail here in Washington. First, it focuses on improving speeds on existing intercity passenger rail. How can we take what we have and make it work even better for people? And then secondly, it thinks about what are those visionary, future-oriented investments that could get us to that truly high-speed rail where we can really turn into a transformational space for our communities. And I think here in Washington, we have engaged for the last couple of years in a really intensive discussion with our colleagues in the province of British Columbia and the state of Oregon around what this would look like. We've involved local government leaders, state leaders, and with consultation with our federal leaders on both sides of the Canadian border to really think through what it would look like for our three jurisdictions to work together. And that's an audacious plan and an audacious vision, but with federal support from Canada, federal support from the US, state and provincial commitments, and a tie-in to the regional systems that exist, I believe there's real potential here to create a high-speed rail passenger system that would build on top of and augment our existing intercity rail. So we'd have all sorts of rail options for folks. It's also worth remembering by the time we get to the 2030s, in the central Puget Sound, hundreds of thousands of people every day will be using rail to get to work. The Sound Transit expansion, both of their commuter rail as well as light rail, are changing the shape of how our region is going to commute. I drive to Seattle every now and then, and I swear, because of COVID, I don't go every day. I usually go a couple times a month, and every time I go, it seems like that light rail has crept a mile or two north. It's making incredible progress. And so when commuters in our region are used to using rail, and now we'll have intercity and high-speed options, I think that's exciting. How do we get there? Well, first of all, we are awaiting with eager anticipation the ruling of the state Supreme Court in the case regarding Initiative 976 to give us a sense of what are our transportation resources. We know if that initiative stays on the books, it means a deeper hole for us to dig out of as we begin building our infrastructure. It felt like the arguments went really well earlier this summer. We're hoping to get a favorable ruling, and then that would let us really begin the process of how do we put meat on the bones? How do we make those short-term improvements in speed and reliability? And how do we chart the path to that truly revolutionary future when we get to those truly high speeds? I think a new administration, whether it's in 2021 or at some point in the future that focuses in on infrastructure, is going to be a critical part of that. And I'm excited that we are talking about rail as a part of the next transportation package here in 2021. We've got to provide funding for a new crossing on the Columbia River, which will include a rail component. And I think that we really need to think about the intersection between potential future rail investments and our efforts to combat global climate change. For the last 4 years, there have been robust dialogues around placing a price on carbon, whether it's a cap and invest program or a carbon tax or some combination of those. And I believe that that's an ideal funding source for the kind of transformational investments that high-speed rail will provide. It will reduce our emissions, give commuters choices. It'll free up space on our existing freight rail networks if we can create that high-speed infrastructure. It solves so many problems all at once. So I think, to me, the budget constraints are really related to this moment with COVID. I think the future, though, of investment at the state level, at the federal level, are incredibly strong. And what we've done in Washington over the last 3 years by building the business case for these future-oriented investments is we are shovel ready in order to, in terms of beginning to make some of these investments. We've identified where the corridor is. We've identified what the ridership estimates are, and we're beginning to, and full speed ahead, building the business plan right now with that executive team and that study that's being done. So I think that there's a lot of groundwork that's been laid. Clearly, FRA has identified our corridor as one that's right for more investments. We, with Joe Biden, a guy that rode Amtrak to work every day, will have someone in the White House that can really make these investments alongside of us. And as I run for Lieutenant Governor, I really view this as an opportunity to talk about economic development for all parts of Washington by building that north-south corridor. We also have taken a look at Seattle to Spokane alignments as well. So we connect all of Washington using this critical technology that we know reduces emissions and moves people safely. And I'm excited to lean in, view this as part of our climate strategy, as part of our economic development strategy, and as a partnership with our neighbors to the north and south to realize a vision that truly will transform our region and give us many more options for folks to move around short of what they have right now. So with that overview, I'm happy to answer questions and just delighted that you're hosting this dialogue and to have a chance to hear from you and engage with you.
Wow, Marco, I've always known you to be perhaps one of the most informed members of the legislature when it comes to transportation and particularly rail. I didn't know you could say that much on one breath. So that's very impressive. I'm sure one question that might come out of our friends from Oregon, a number of whom are on this webinar, but also interesting to us too, is you mentioned that the a rail bridge in across the Columbia, and it was our understanding that that may not have been part of the discussion going forward with the new committee that's working on that. So can you say a little bit more about that? I didn't know that they were taking that up.
Yeah, I think we had a successful design in 2012, 2013 that included a light rail connection between Vancouver into the existing system. We know that the federal government was going to be a partner through the Federal Transit Administration, actually, in that case. I believe that effort, creating just a highway connection in 2020 is not future looking. We have to make sure that it can accommodate all modes of transportation, including that light rail connection. And I think we really have to be looking at freight rail capacity along the corridor. Now, the existing plan doesn't speak specifically to freight rail, but I think we've got to think about the multi-modes that will move in that corridor and not think just about a highway connection. It's got to be across the board. And I know that the planning team is looking at a variety of options because it's really critical. When we build this new bridge, it's not going to, just like the current one that's there, it's not for 20 years, it's for 50 or 100 years. And it has to really envision what the future of transportation is, and it needs to be multimodal in that way.
Yes, yeah, I think you've answered part of the question, because I know the light rail thing was an issue with the folks down there, and we're not going to talk about that tonight. But I had heard from our sister organization, Aorta in Oregon, that at one point the BNSF rail bridge there should have been or would have been considered as part of a discussion of improving the cross-river transportation, but is not part of it now. But hearing you speak to the freight implications, as well as the fact that that is used by the Amtrak Cascades and the Coast Starlight, we certainly could use a better rail bridge over the Columbia too. I'm going to look for some more questions from people. I'm sorry if I didn't see your hands up before. I can only see some of the screens that might be out there. Please use that chat function at the bottom of your screen and send a message to us or your question. Don't see any yet. Well, Senator, I appreciate your energy, your enthusiasm. I know you know a lot about this. I'm really hoping that all the board can help the legislature look at how we can have a a more comprehensive understanding of what passenger rail, the Amtrak Cascades in particular, can do. It's not been something that has inspired a lot of people when I was in the legislature or since, but with this study that we did on the east-west feasibility, I think that people are realizing, particularly those folks in Eastern Washington, that they've kind of been left out, and this is a chance for them to have a better connection, not only to the west side, but even to Spokane. As has been mentioned several times, Yakima is the largest metropolitan area that does not have any kind of passenger rail service, not, I guess, in the Northwest, and maybe, I think one of our fellows said, perhaps on the West Coast. So what do you think about that particular project getting a little more airtime and possibly for future consideration? Because we need some more studies to really figure out what it's going to take to do that. But some of the numbers that we've seen earlier tonight, if you were watched any of that, indicate that there's a lot more that needs to be done for the legislature and the public to understand the benefits of that east-west connection.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I was really delighted at the ridership estimates on that corridor. I think there's a sense that, people don't want to look to rail, and that studies show that there's a clear demand that exists in Yakima and the Tri-Cities all the way to Spokane for that sort of connection. So I think what we really need, and that's why All Aboard is such a critical partner, is that grassroots conversation on the ground with affected communities to really inspire folks to imagine and think about the possibilities. And, for a couple generations, we haven't thought about rail as part of the solution, at least as we do our statewide planning. It's been a highways only approach. And so it's time to really think about what are some of these other possibilities and how do we plan for that future where we know that people are going to be moving in different ways. And so I'm excited to build off of, I think that the East-West study was just the first step. I think we've got to do much more work in building a fuller business case there. But what I saw in that initial report was that there's a lot of possibility. And if you think about, we've got a parallel study going on around where we should site a major airport facility. And in Moses Lake, there's some fantastic capacity there. So you could begin to think about some of the intermodal connections into the future for both freight and passenger traffic. This is clearly an area we got to keep exploring. And I'm just excited that we've cracked the nut and we're not taking that windshield only approach. We're thinking about rail, we're thinking about how all of these pieces interrelate to each other with the future of air travel. And so that we can give, in my view, and I know you agree, Luis, has been to give people choices. Let consumers make the choice around how they want to move. Today, most people have just one choice. Let's expand that universe, and we can tackle a lot of other challenges, create economic development, reduce our carbon emissions, and create safer ways of people moving around the state at the same time. So I'm excited to lean into this conversation. I think it's just beginning, but the early nubs are really, really productive. We just need to feed that grassroots energy and get everyday Washingtonians to think about this as a potential solution, and All Aboard is going to be a critical part of that.
Senator, we have just a couple of minutes, but we do have one more question that you might have a response to. There's a question with regard to, has there been any discussions about throughway bus connections to train service from Pullman and possibly Coeur d'Alene?
I don't know the answer to whether those particular corridors have been looked at. Obviously, WashDOT does operate some intercity bus in Eastern Washington, and then the Dungeness route on the peninsula over here as well. So I don't know that they went as detailed into that, but that certainly should be a part of that next step to think about how we can interrelate with these other corridors as well, because that's a great point. We've got a lot of people that head to Pullman to study Wazoo, and with the growth of the economy we're seeing south of Spokane down, I think it makes sense to think about all these connections. And I don't think that the study went to those specific corridors, but those are good points to include in future work.
Thank you.
Okay, hearing no more questions or seeing nothing come up, I'm going to move on to our next presenter and speaker, Representative Tom Dent. Tom is an old colleague of mine from the House Transportation Committee and a member of the Legislative Rail Caucus and an All Aboard Washington supporter. He's been to a number of our whistle stops and the lunches that the Rail Caucus has. Good to see you again, Tom. Thanks for coming. And as you can see, you are the legislator from the Central Washington who stands the most to help us understand what the needs are there. So take it away.
Well, thank you, Louis, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here, although I'm not exactly sure why I'm here, other than my Senator Warnick, who is co-chair of the Rail Caucus, and I work together quite a lot, and we talk a lot about, the movie Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Well, I'm the planes guy. I'm the guy that flies airplanes and is working on the new airport project, and Senator Warnick is the one who works on the rail. So, but she wasn't able to be here tonight, and so, I guess you got the second best, but I do appreciate it. And rail is something that we really need. And I've watched the rail, all of my life, when I was young, and the rail here was very efficient and it moved a lot of products, and we've watched it kind of deteriorate. Our tracks go downhill, and we get to the point to where we're at now is a kind of a point of a critical decision making. We need to decide if we're going to rebuild our rails and put this program back together and make it work. And if we're not, then we need to come up with a different plan. So a couple of years ago, I had a chance to go to Japan on a trade mission, and it was an incredible trip for me, and I learned so much. But probably the most important thing that I learned when I was over there was how they make their rail system work, how their high-speed rail works, how they move people so fast, efficiently, on time, and even not every train over there goes 180 miles an hour. Some of them only go 100, but they made all their trains really work. And it was incredible to watch the people work, and they were so comfortable. I have to tell you, for a guy who spent my career flying airplanes and going fast, I enjoyed riding those trains over there because they were efficient and they were very, very comfortable and very quiet. So, so today I was up at Reardon. Today I'm do a lot of ag issues, and I had a grower up there had some issues with ag, so I drove up and they kind of showed me their problems around it. And on the way back, there's the Burlington Northern has a rail that comes down through Highway 2 there, and pretty soon I was paralleling the train, and we're going down the highway, and I stopped at I got caught there in Wilson Creek at one of the train crossings and had a chance to count the cars and watch it work. And it made me think, as I watched the train work, the work that we have to do to improve our rail system and to make it work more efficiently for us all, not only in Eastern Washington, but across the entire state and across the entire nation. So I drove up, and they caught me twice today. I stopped for the same train twice up at Stratford. I stopped again and watched the wheels and listened to them. And I know that there's a lot to a train, having been in the mechanics all my life. And I realized how much that we have to do and the things that we have to think about in order to help all this stuff move along. So about 15 years ago in Moses Lake, we were looking at bringing the rail down from up north, up by Stratford, in the north into Grant County Airport. And at that time, it was $750,000 a mile to put the rail in, if we had the ground, and we did, but we didn't do it. And I think now it's somewhere around $1 million, and that's a lot of money. And I think it's time that we start taking a look and decide to make a commitment to improving our rail structure in this state, where not only we can move our farm products, but we can also move people, because we have to have good solid rail if we're going to put people on those tracks and move them with any kind of efficiency. And I think we can do that, but we have to make that decision. We have to make that commitment to do that. So, and a couple of years ago, again, after I came home from Japan, we had a rail tour, and I think you might have been on that, Luis. I'm not sure, but I was up at Spokane or Reardon, and we rode the rail up there and saw firsthand the condition of the rails, and made me really think a lot about it, which is where I came back to today, watching the train come down the BN train come down the tracks. And I'm thinking about, how do we improve the rail, and how can we do this efficiently? And keep our timeline short, which is what we really need to do, because I think we do have an opportunity right now to, we're going to have to get people back to work here, and there's an opportunity to a transportation package to improve our transportation infrastructure. I think is something that we really need to take a hard look at and do, because we can't, the way we're continuing, we are never going to get ahead of this highway congestion the way we're going. It doesn't matter how much money we have, it doesn't matter how much we tax our gasoline, it's not going to happen, because as we build it, we outgrow it. So we need to come up with a different plan. So I'm pretty excited. So my topic was communities working together. That was my topic. So I guess maybe we'll get to that now. So this week on Tuesday, I don't know if you can see this or not, I'll hold this up. Headlines in the Moses Lake paper was exciting news. Show that to you again. Exciting news. This is exciting news. And what this is about was we received our 9.9, they released our $9.9 million grant from the federal government so we can continue our rail infrastructure into Grant County Airport, along with the $20.9 million received here 2 or 3 years ago from the state. So this is going to, I think, finish our track into Grant County Airport, which is really so important. That's the Port of Moses Lake. It's so important for, you know, the economic condition of our community as well as the state. But communities working together. We need to fix our rail to move our products. And as we build our rails together and we sell it to our communities and our population, that's how we're going to rebuild our rails so we can move people. It's going to move together, and we have to work this together. And if we do this, it's no different than we talk about the new airport, you know, and moving freight on aircraft and moving people on aircraft. It has to work together, and that's how we're going to make it grow and make it boom and make it work for all of us. So I think as we begin to build this, our community here is becoming more and more excited about the new, getting the exciting news, getting the rail into Moses Lake. It's going to be really great. It's going to really help us grow here, and we're all excited about that. But, you know, how can we pursue that? How can we transform that into some passenger service? And I think we can. I know we can. It's just a matter of selling the communities, getting people on board. And that's how communities can work together to not only improve our freight system, to move our ag commodities, which is very, very important, move our manufacturing commodities in the Grant County Airport. And but we need to move our people. So I'm excited about being able to do that. I think transportation, we have to rethink some of our transportation ideas and needs and thoughts and desires as we go forward into the future. And I think rail can be a big part of that. And as again, I say, I was so sold on the high-speed rail when I was in Japan. It was just such an incredible way to travel that my Senator Warren gets tired of me talking about the high-speed rail in Japan. So anyway, I appreciate that, the opportunity to talk about this a little bit, but I see a big future, a bright future with our rail. If we can do, we just have to sell it to our constituents and get behind it and make a move.
Thank you, Representative. I appreciate your comments about high speed and also about freight, because All Aboard Washington does, you know, pay attention to that. We're not just about passenger rail, but then being the only consumer-oriented group in the state that is talking about intercity passenger rail. That is mostly what we are working on at this time. And as the East-West corridor runs through your district, and several cities are affected by that, I'm hoping that you can help us have that discussion with your constituents there, particularly at Ellensburg. We did a study a couple of years ago from the Western Washington University with students, and we also had a study out of Central there a few years also looking at the need for passenger rail. So I think that moving people, as you said, is extremely important to your district and the adjoining areas in the valley there. You can help us a lot to make sure that we're paying attention to what people are looking for, and perhaps informing them of something that they haven't up to this time thought there was much chance of happening. But we are getting such good feedback in the work we've been doing for the last 2 years or so in the Central Valley. We know that people want to know more about this. We've just got to find the opportunity to talk to them. It's too bad this has to be virtual, because we were hoping to be actually out in those cities doing these train treks, but this is pretty good. On the high speed matter, just to make a point, yes, we love it. It's probably something we can't do without federal support, but you know, that is so far in the future, you know, a decade and a half at least, just to be conservative there. And I think that it's only going to work well if we have the other modalities, particularly intercity passenger, of feeding into it. So we've got to work with what we have now. The Amtrak Cascades is an asset the state's been working on for, you know, over 20 years. And our return on investment for all of that over the 20 years has got to expand to realize some of the aspirations that are in legislation and in RCW that we are hoping to accomplish by now. But again, due to budget cutbacks, we're behind where we thought we would be, but we're not going to be where we want to be unless we get back in supporting the Amtrak Cascades and to be becoming what we always thought it would be, the high-speed ground transportation. So do we see any questions? I see one chat question
Yes,
there.
we have,
Go ahead,
we have
Charlie.
one. Gary has one for Representative Dent.
Representative Dent, I lived in Tokyo for 6 years, and I came to appreciate the rail system over there just as much as you did. It isn't just high speed. I mean, when I left my home, I could take my bicycle about 6 or 8 blocks and get on a residential surface train, and that would connect into the faster trains that fed to downtown Tokyo, and there I could get on the Shinkansen and go to Kyoto or wherever I want to do. It's an amazing thing that many Americans do not appreciate because we don't have it.
That's right. Yeah. Well, thank you for those comments. But back to you, Luis, when you're talking about, you know, how do we get there, and we're 10 or we're 15 years out? Well, you know, it was like 15 years ago when we were talking about bringing the rail in from up by Stratford into the north end of Grant County Airport, and we didn't do it. And now the price has increased another 25 to 30% per mile. And it's 25 years ago we talked about a second lake crossing in Moses Lake, and we still haven't done it. Now the price is 5 times what it was then. And there has to come a time that we make a decision, we make a commitment to start moving forward, whether it's a study on how to do it and begin to make a plan and chart that path to success. And it may be, I see we have, in an ideal world, how should transportation be funded in Washington? And that's part of what we're going to have to do now. That's part of what we have to begin. How are we going to fund these things? How are we going to make them work? Yes, it's 10 or 15 years out, but if we don't start making a plan today, then guess what? In 5 years or 10 years, we're sitting here doing the same thing, and you're going to tell me it's 10 to 15 years out. And so that's why it's so important that we start now. And you know, there may be some difficult questions. We may not be able to start, but if we begin to make our plan, that's how we're going to get there. And that's the way I learned to set a goal and to achieve it, was to start that plan.
Those are great observations. You know, I just started to work with the JTC Transportation Needs Assessment Panel. And if there's one thing we all recognize, and I think everybody on this call recognizes, that between the pandemic and in Washington State with the I-976, the revenue cutbacks, the best thing to do right now is to really ask ourselves for a reset. We can't really go back and pick up where we thought we might have been even a year or two ago. This is a great opportunity to really evaluate everything that's out there now and figure out how we're going to do just what you said, Representative, to what do we really need to do now? Because what we could have done and should have done, too bad, but we can't go back and pick that up, but we have to make some really hard decisions about what we want our transportation system, both freight and passenger, to look like, you know, in 10, 15 years from now, and get moving on that. And just so you know, Gary asked you a question. I don't know if you were here at the beginning of the session, but he is a former FAA manager, and 2 speakers after you, we have Mr. Lawrence Crowder from the Spokane Airport going to speak. So we recognize the need to connect with the airline industry and how that is part of the overall transportation system. So if you can hang on for another, 20 minutes or so, you may want to ask some of your own questions about how we're going to do that. Anything else, Representative?
We also have a really good question that I think is probably a completely separate event, which is in an ideal world, how should transportation be funded in Washington? I would argue that we should have that a completely separate conversation about that. And we'll definitely put that together as part of the events that we're working on right now.
Yes, and for those folks who are on this call and might be interested in the next 4 train treks we're going to do, I have been talking to some of the legislators about using our last event on December 5th as a wrap-up. What have we heard in the previous 4 train treks about the priorities of what projects should go forward? And then again, how are we going to pay for it? And will there be anything on December 5th, the day of that event, that shows us any potential budgets or transportation plans that might be floated out by that time? It'd be wonderful to have as many legislators as possible participate in that discussion as we ask ourselves, how are we going to, dig out of the hole we're in, and which way should we go? Thanks again, Representative. Our next speaker was supposed to be David Stromeier from Missoula, Montana. He's a county commissioner out there and a member of the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority that's trying to initiate cross Montana service that has been eliminated before. Because he's not able to be with us tonight, Barry Green, who is from Montana also, and a representative on a state representative for Rail Passenger Association, our national affiliate, and the Northwest Division leader for the rail passenger groups in the Northwest United States, has agreed to say a few things about how that Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority is looking to improve and advance passenger rail in southern Montana. Are you there, Barry?
I sure am, Luis. Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you to you and Charlie for setting up this forum this evening. A lot of interesting speakers. I'm nowhere near as fluent and smooth as many of them are, but I do have some information in front of me relevant to what Dave Stromeier would have presented that may be of interest to the group. About a year ago, coming up towards about the third week of October, will be a year ago when Dave Stromeier convened a meeting of interested parties in Billings, Montana for a Southeast Passenger Rail Summit. Figured that we were going to do one early springtime here, but then things just didn't work with Dave Stromeier's schedule, and then the COVID-19 came on, so that kind of faltered everything. And he was hoping to have a get-together meeting in the Missoula area. That fell apart too. So now he's putting together a virtual meeting on September 17th, Thursday, September 17th, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But on this Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority, he contacted all of the counties along the southern route of Montana, or the route where the former North Coast Hiawatha had traveled through. And he did get 12 counties of interest that they would like to be part of this Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority. And according to the state law, which is where this was found and where this idea was hatched, you only need 2 counties to sign on officially to form this authority. But he's got a pretty good feeling that there will be more signing on. It's been kind of interesting which counties have and haven't signed on, and no real reason given, except I think they're just watching from the sidelines to see what's going to happen when it comes to the financial aspects of anything like this. So he'd like to take a regional approach to this whole thing, not just necessarily look at a return to a North Coast Hiawatha route, but he's also been corresponding with people in Colorado and Wyoming to look at something for like Billings south towards Denver. And he's also been coordinating efforts in western part of the state and into Utah for possible routing of Butte to Salt Lake City. Now, some of these are a little more shooting to the moon, I can say, being a railroader for 39 years, now retired. But some of them do have merit. So I don't honestly know, Luis, if he's conversed with you or whoever else in Washington or Oregon. My take is, from the last time I had spoke with him, he was hoping to put something together that involved Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Utah, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado. So I'm not sure if all the parties are there, all the players are lined up for what he's trying to formulate here. He's also been corresponding with our Montana delegation to include language in the Surface Transportation Bill to create an additional multi-state rail commission, similar to what's in effect with the Southern Rail Commission down in the southeast part of the country. And that's kind of where he's put his list of speakers together for this passenger rail summit coming up on Thursday, September 17, scheduled from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Mountain Time, 10 to 1 Mountain Time. He's got several speakers lined up. John Robert Smith, Jim Matthews from RPA, Rob Eaton from Amtrak. Side note, although I don't know how the meeting went, Rob Eaton was on our part of the country and had a meeting with the Montana Rail Link president. Now, obviously, it must have something to do with what Dave Stromeier has been focusing on. I don't know if MRL is getting scared over the deal or they were just fishing for information, maybe. So I do know that Rob Eaton was supposed to be in Missoula for a meeting already. And people that are interested in this event can go to the website montanapassengerrailsummit.org. montanapassengerrailsummit.org. You can sign up there. There's also information on the speakers that are confirmed to speak if no problems arise. And it looks like it'll be quite a gathering. So side note also, information of who he's been talking to in Colorado. He's been dealing with Jim Suby, who many of you know, Colorado president and a member of the Front Range Rail Commission. And he's also spoken with a gentleman named Dan Klein, the head of Wyoming's DOT rail division. Of course, I had tipped off, Dave, that Wyoming's probably going to be a little tougher nut to crack because they've been dished twice by Amtrak coming and going. And I really don't.
Barry, we're running out of time. I'm sorry to break it off, but we do need to move forward. And thank you for the information.
Okay.
I think what you're saying, Barry, is that a lot of people in different states are looking at restoring intercity service. Amtrak is not in the position or not willing to do that, so we have to do it ourselves. And the idea of a Northwest Rail Commission has come up before with some folks out of Idaho that approached our sister organization in Oregon, Aorta, and we had a meeting with them a month or so back too. So we'll get more information about that larger effort, and hopefully some of us can attend Dave's meeting in September.
Yep.
So moving on to our final presenter, Larry Crowder, who's the CEO of the Spokane Airport and also on the JTC Transportation Needs Assessment Panel that I'm sitting on, who is going to give us a view on how we're looking at assessing statewide transportation and where airlines and airports fit into that. So, Mr. Crowder, are you ready?
Yes, good evening, Luis, and thank you for having me. And I'll say hello to Representative Dent, fellow aviator and tireless transportation advocate for all of us. And also like to say hello to my friend Ron Pate, who we've worked with over the years at WashDOT, a very capable and helpful professional. As Luis mentioned, I am co-chairing the Needs Assessment Panel with Judy Cliburn, who I've had the pleasure, and many of you have had the pleasure of working with, and of course Representative Dent having had the pleasure of working with for a long time in the House. And Luis also mentioned, you know, we have some challenges that we're dealing with. Probably one of the most interesting times to be looking at a 10-year transportation needs assessment by jurisdiction and by mode. And then, you know, looking at a menu of funding options that we have to consider, and looking at the limitations around Initiative 976, and of course the ongoing structural problems with revenue associated with the recession caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. In the discussions, and we've had one meeting so far, and I thought it was a really great start for our work. But in the meeting, and I think this is what Luis wanted me to emphasize, is that one of the things that I think we need to really think differently about with regard to what we want the transportation system to look like 10 years from now and beyond is the issue of intermodalism. And Representative Dent touched on that in the example that he offered about the connectivity that Grant County is seeking. And I think it is looking at those types of intermodal connections. Frankly, I think state DOTs, and I'm not going to single out WashDOT, but I think many state DOTs have really struggled with intermodalism. There's, you know, they talk about multimodalism and things like that, but intermodalism is really hard because you're after seeking out these strategic connections. And we are pursuing here in Spokane a very similar project to what Representative Dent talked about, we've actually, with help from WashDOT and the legislature, have extended rail from a spur line into the heart of airport property that is available for non-aeronautical development. And we have recruited Mullen Technologies, which is an electric car manufacturing company, to part of that land, in part because they need rail. We also have received a build grant to construct a transload facility, and that transload facility will be built next year. And so we really see the need to utilize the transportation infrastructure that is in place around Spokane International Airport in a much more strategic and efficient way, where we're bringing together, again, cost efficiencies from surface transportation and air transportation. And I don't think it's an accident that Amazon chose Spokane for its new fulfillment center that has opened recently. And obviously, we anticipate that we will see their airline at Spokane International Airport in support of that fulfillment center. But I can tell you, they're also very interested in the rail project and interested in the transload facility. So I do think that the intermodal connectivity is going to be a very important element of what we need to do. And of course, rail and passenger rail needs to fit in there. One of the things that I thought was interesting when we were talking about the concepts that we have to advance is that we've heard examples tonight of projects that are happening kind of on an intra-regional basis, and I would include in that the Spokane Transit Authority Central City Line project that is currently it's entering into construction. And that will build a bus rapid transit line connecting some really significant employment centers and Gonzaga University through the downtown area. But we really ought to be looking at bringing that Central City Line all the way out to Spokane International Airport. And I think one of the things we need to think about is that as we pursue projects that are somewhat intra-regional, we need to keep in mind the opportunities that those intra-regional projects may be able to give us to build a statewide, system. And I think if we break that down, into regional projects with a statewide system in mind, we might have a lot more potential success because we can use those intra-regional projects to benefit the metro areas. But again, hopefully, as those have independent utility, they'll still have a functional relationship to a statewide system that could be used for passenger rail as well as freight rail. So, the other thing that I think is important is that as we talk about the diminished resources that we're going to be facing in terms of revenue options, and the possibility of looking at new revenue, I think Representative Dent said it well, is that, how much more can we afford to tax ourselves at the state level for, on gas, and how expensive is gas going to have to be before it modifies behaviors. And one of the things that's on my mind is the realities that many of the regions, I believe, are going to have to begin to tax themselves for the types of transportation system that they want to have, because the state is going to be very, I think, constrained in terms of delivering on anything much more than probably maintenance and preservation types of projects, at least probably through the next intermediate period. So I think along those lines, as people look at the true costs of maintaining the transportation system that we have, the networks that we have, I do think that it's going to begin to make better arguments for rail. And I think that it's just like when we argue about, the price of asphalt versus concrete. And depending on the price of oil, those things, have different nexuses. And so one of the things I think we're going to have to look at is how do we build a system that might work in regions, but then be able to be, again, connected to the whole. So I'll stop there. And I know I want to be respectful of time and ask if there's any questions, or hopefully I haven't offended anybody with my thinking there. So I'll turn it back to Luis or Charles.
No, thank you, Larry. You did a great overview that sometimes is lost with people who are just focusing on their own modality. And I know that a lot of folks who are, hyper excited about the high-speed rail think that that is going to solve all kinds of problems, and it'll be part of a solution, whenever it can be built. It's what do we do before we get to that point? And it's being able to convince those folks that they should also be looking at the intercity passenger rail that we are focusing on, because that is elemental to that. Can you say a little more about how you see regional airports developing and how they need to be connected to rail in order for that to work better? Because a lot of what we're hearing, and I think it's intuitive also, is that not everybody has a car or wants to take a car to drive to, let alone Seattle or Spokane or anywhere else. So how do these regional airports figure into the system we're looking at in the future? And what's happening down at the Pasco Airport? There's been talk about reduced service down there.
Well, as you can imagine, we're all in a reset because of COVID, and rethinking all of our models. But I truly believe, and always have as a planner, that that airports really ought to be really where a lot of those connections take place. There's a lot of infrastructure that's available that, in my view, could be used in more flexible ways. And airports, by their nature, and are organized around that connectivity with surface transportation and air transportation. We're the interface. So why has rail been left out of that? I think that's to me, it's really something that's missing, and that's why I'm so convinced that and I think one thing I will just go back to, Luis, really quick, is that I think one of the problems is when you start talking about a very large network, you start talking about a really large price tag, and it's much easier to dismiss it from thinking, as opposed to talking about intra-regional projects that then, form a system over time and bring this independent utility to sub, regional areas. And so it's just something I think that we all need to be thinking about, as opposed to, where people can fuzz up around big numbers and just say, oh my gosh, that's never going to happen, right? So, I think it's just something I wanted to make sure we got back to. But the reality is that as airlines continue to recalibrate, regional airports are going to be really challenged because the airlines are, as they're looking at their economic models, are likely to shrink. And that means they're likely to operate less frequency, larger aircraft flying less often in between some of the smaller communities in the state, like Pasco, like Yakima, Wenatchee, Spokane, et cetera, into the larger metro areas. And so I think that it's going to be an inflection point because people are going to have less choice. And as airports evolve, I hope, as intermodal, connection nodes, I think communities have to start looking at these investments and saying, hey, you know what, we want to move freight, over rail, or have an interface for surface, or air transportation. How do we integrate moving people maybe inside the metro area to the airport more efficiently? Because maybe that's the investment we want to make, instead of continuing to invest in highway capacity, that's obviously very expensive and, to maintain. And we're running, we're upside down right now in that equation. So I do think that those things need to be brought into the planning process. And I've been reading a lot lately about, some of the flaws that we have in our transportation demand modeling out there. And I think that's where, in part, what has contributed to a lack of intermodal and, strategic connectivity in our system. A lot of the models and a lot of the traditional ways of planning really don't lend themselves to this kind of thinking. So we're going to probably have to try to break the paradigm a little bit in terms of some of the things that we're doing to emphasize the importance of passenger rail. Because again, I think it's going to be a very long recovery for air transportation. I do think there is going to be less capacity offered in smaller communities, yet there's still going to be this need to move around. And then, communities are going to have to start making I think some different types of choices if they are faced with having to invest more in that transportation network. And I think that will begin to shift some of the thinking towards, rubber tire or steel wheel solutions like bus rapid transit, like, the concepts you guys are all talking about. So I'll stop there.
Yes, I think we're running up on.
We're
time
running
anyway,
out of time
Charlie.
at TVW, but if anybody wants to stick around, please do. Thank you for everyone who's been participating on TVW. Please follow us at aawa.us, and if those of you who can stick around, please do. Thank you.
Thanks again, everybody. We are going to wrap it up now. We do have 4 more of these train tracks, and certainly a lot of what we're learning tonight will be repeated in one fashion or another. We'll have to get some of the data that we've seen from our presenters, but we want to make sure that the other 4 regions that we're going to take this to also have their own local participants, and we all can see how is this going to land on people who are living in the Tri-Cities area, or Ellensburg, Cle Elum, and Auburn, that there's a whole lot to talk about here and to share this information. So we'll be getting back into that. Charlie, how much longer? I know we're not on TVW anymore, right? We're timed out there. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
We can, I think at this point, we're probably best just going forward with the, with the follow-up that we wanted to do, Luis.
Charlie, there's an interesting comment from John Nuxall here that has to do with Spokane, that maybe it's actually correct, I think, as I read it. You want to go ahead and handle that?
I can certainly read it. The question is, I believe Seattle is the only other Washington city served by air from Spokane. He says there's no air service between Spokane, Pasco, and Yakima or Wenatchee. Is that correct? And if so, what is the future look like?
That is correct. This is Larry speaking. That is correct. And there have been initiatives from time to time by smaller airlines. You may remember an airline called Seaport Airlines that was initially stood up around the concept of a smaller commuter airline that would just fly between Seattle and Portland, therefore the Seaport designation. But even 4 or 5 years ago, Seaport had approached us in Spokane as possibly being a hub for them to serve Grant County, Pasco, Yakima, Wenatchee, like Pendleton and some other areas with Cessna Caravan aircraft, and then fly those aircraft into Spokane and connect those passengers to the mainline carriers. So their model was something that they were pursuing, but they could not make the costs competitive enough without having to have some kind of a subsidy, I think, from the communities to make that work. And they had a heck of a time with the reservation systems and other things interfacing with the mainline carriers. So there's those thoughts were they're out there. I don't think they're going to be anytime soon because of what's happening right now, with the air transportation industry. But there have been those ideas from time to time that we've worked with people on.
Well, I think that's interesting, Larry, because that's one of the reasons we need passenger rail service.
Yeah, I think Gary, it points out the fact that to try to connect those communities by air, I think is probably very unlikely. Even when the economy was doing well and Seaport was really engaged with us, they still were struggling to make it work financially with their model. So I I would say, yeah, if anybody says that, you know, air service is going to be an alternative to passenger rail to connect some of these metros areas, I would probably challenge them. You know, I think what we are up against probably more than anything else in terms of the passenger rail is probably the price of gas and, you know, people's, you know, addiction to, you know, their ultimate freedom machines.
Yeah.
Okay. There's still some chats coming in here. Let me take a look at that.
So there are a couple of questions here. One of them is a comment regarding the real. It's easy to think of this as a Seattle Spokane train, but they feel that the real market will be smaller distances such as Yakima, Spokane, or Pasco, Seattle. And that is actually one of the STEER study's findings, was that the shorter distances were going to be important. Abe, you would remember the details of that, but that is, I believe, what STEER came up with.
Can you say, I would remember the details of what precisely in the STEER report?
Yeah, having to do with the fact that a lot of the ridership was going to be the shorter endpoints rather than the full length.
Certainly, yeah, and that's actually a dynamic that you find in every rail corridor. I mean, one of the fundamental differences between rail travel and almost anything else is the fact that endpoint to endpoint travel is a minority of the overall passengers. And so the bulk of their ridership that they projected, although they did not publish this, we have asked them to distribute it. They haven't given us the precise numbers, but what they said was the peak in the ridership was actually just beyond Yakima. And a lot of that was, you know, kind of the central Washington area going to both Spokane and the Puget Sound region. So it was following that trend. And actually, they said that they actually had completed very granular ridership information, and they found some surprising lumpiness in those projections. However, they have not yet provided those projections, even though they said that they had them available and could do so. So we just need to ping them again. Just because I think that'll be really valuable for legislators in the middle of the state to know.
Right. I have been asking for that information, and that hasn't been forthcoming yet, but hopefully we'll get it soon.
Thanks, Luis.
And at this point, I think we should just end by saying that there are more of these train treks coming. The details will be on the website. The next one is going to be Ellensburg on Saturday, September 19th. All of these are planned to be virtual meetings until further notice, until we can. Then after that, we have the Tri-Cities on Saturday, October 17th. And then after that, we have Cle Elum on Saturday, November 21st. And as Luis suggested earlier, the last one will be on Saturday, December 5th. That is nominally for Auburn, but it's probably going to be a wrap-up of what we've learned so far. And so we're very interested in everyone's feedback as to what you have, what you think works well with these and how we can improve them. We're very interested in your feedback, and thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, Larry. Appreciate those comments.
Thank you all. Appreciate the time, and this is a very energizing enterprise we're getting into, and we know that we've got a lot to say, and there's certainly a lot of people who need to know how to evaluate what we're looking at with all of these transportation issues. Larry and I, of course, on the needs assessment, will be having a report to the JTC and the legislature. We'll be wrapping up around the same time, perhaps, that the good work that Larry as co-chair and our co-chair, former Representative Judy Cliburn, who was a wonderful chair for me. We will probably have some things to share at that time also that will help us to get the big picture and some detail. Thanks again for everybody for showing up tonight. Appreciate that.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.